Welcome to the podcast series, Us and Them, brought to you by Heidelberg University's Graduate School for Humanities and Social Sciences. Tune in for thought-provoking interviews with experts in different fields, from the social sciences to the humanities, from law to economics. Hello and welcome to the podcast series, Us and Them. Today we have a really prominent guest in our studio, Selin Beyhan, from the Department of English Studies at the Faculty of Modern Languages, Heidelberg University. Welcome, Selin.
Thank you very much, and hi.
Today we are going to talk about the topic of zooming in on individuals in post-apocalyptic fiction, emotions and coping strategies in times of transition. So it sounds like a really interesting topic, but Selin, I'd like to first ask you briefly to explain us your academic background, and maybe in it we can find some choices. Why did you choose that topic?
Thank you very much, Sinan. So, my bachelor degree is from Boğaziçi University in Istanbul, Turkey, Translation and Interpreting Studies. So, I'm originally a translator who translated a couple of literary works from English to Turkish. And afterwards, I completed English teaching certificate programs at Cambridge Institute and at Hacettepe University in Ankara. And then I finished my master's at the University of Heidelberg in English Studies. So my major was literature, minor was linguistics, and I've been writing my PhD thesis at the same faculty under supervision of Professor Veran.
Well, you are working on a really interesting topic right now, and one of the interesting facts about your research topic is that you started working on this topic before the COVID-19 pandemic. So, did that create a hype in terms of readers' expectation from your work, or would you like to be called as an oracle maybe when you also chose that topic for your research?
What a vision, right? Probably yes. It created hype in terms of readers' expectations because now I've been receiving comments, oh, what an interesting and relevant topic. And I have to say, well, hey, I started actually writing on that long before pandemic, but actually pandemic also served in a good way to my purpose, I can say. Interestingly, like my curiosity for emotional reactions of characters, of people in times of change were evoked while I was working for corporates after finishing my master's, and it coincided with the time where big organizational structures were taking place in that corporate. So I was observing the emotional reactions of employees at the face of losing their positions, their job, or just the change itself they had been wishing to avoid for years. And I was, playing with the idea of doing something interdisciplinary for my PhD research, and it dawned on me that I could shift those human reactions from corporate life to the realm of literature. And started reading about change, about people's reactions to it, and infusing it with my personal interest in speculative fiction, like horror, post-apocalyptic fiction, and so on. And I came up with the idea of applying these observations into post-apocalyptic fiction, where change actually plays the main role. And then COVID kicked off, and the rest is history. So I told you that it served in a way that pandemic. So at that point, that pandemic has shown a silver lining, so to say, a bittersweet opportunity through which I could observe and experience the possible emotional effects of an apocalypse at first hand. I mean, fortunately, in a milder sense. So during this phase, this unbearable heaviness of being a human with lots of emotional burdens on the shoulders in the face of an apocalypse struck me and convinced me even more firmly of the value of zooming in on the individuals and bringing this approach to post-apocalyptic reading from a psychological perspective.
Well, thank you so much for your extensive elaboration on this topic. And I think that also creates a great cliffhanger in order to learn more actually from your initial findings from this post-apocalyptic fiction. But I'd like to first concretize more this term, post-apocalyptic fiction. And you have also differentiated between apocalyptic fiction, post-apocalyptic fiction, and post-apocalyptic dystopia in your research. Maybe would you like to elaborate more what's that difference is all about?
Actually, these are overlapping. These have many common features. So in my thesis, I actually want to be consistent with my terminology. That's why I stayed with post-apocalyptic fiction. If we are to underline some differences, some subtle differences, apocalyptic fiction focuses more on the apocalypse itself, how it happened, or maybe what was the reason. So apocalypse actually has a main role there. Post-apocalyptic fiction, so of course, it also has place for the apocalypse itself, but it focuses more on the afterwards, the aftermath of apocalypse. So I'm not sure if it is easy to differentiate between apocalyptic fiction and post-apocalyptic fiction in that sense, because a novel can be a post-apocalyptic and apocalyptic fiction at the same time. First part of the novel can be dedicated to apocalypse itself, and the second part can be dedicated to the aftermath. So it's actually just a matter of having a consistent terminology here. And post-apocalyptic dystopia differs here a bit more, because in dystopia we focus more on a disrupted social order, which is mainly characterized by an unfair, unjust authority. So it is more about the whole world order, the whole social structure. Think about, for example, Hunger Games. So it's not only about apocalypse, it's not only about individuals, it's all about the whole system. And it actually resonates with more pessimistic approach, so to say. When we call it dystopia, well, there is no way to get rid of this. There is no way to maybe change it in a better way. But post-apocalyptic fiction doesn't always indicate that things are going to be worse.
Sure, and it's fair to say that they can also be included in the same work actually at the same time, so they are not excluding each other. Normally, it's also the case that you find actually these three terms in the same works.
Absolutely, absolutely.
All right, thank you so much. And focusing on this emphasis on the contemporary part of your work, actually, because you are focusing on contemporary post-apocalyptic fiction. So I'd like to ask you first, which works are you examining in your research?
So some of them might sound very familiar to our listeners. So the first novel I'm analyzing is Station 11 by Emily Mandel. I think there is also a movie or a film on that. I haven't watched it, but might be that. So that's why it can sound familiar to listeners. I don't know. So Station 11 is one novel, and another novel is The Beginning at the End by Mike Chen. The Book of M by Peng Shefford. And these are multi-perspective novels, so to say. So we have actually multiple different internal focalizers. And we have Dog Stars by Peter Heller and The City Where We Once Lived by Eric Barnes, and Severance by Ling Ma. And Severance, I think, also can sound familiar to our listeners because it has been a very popular series, which I haven't watched. I'm staying away from adaptations when I'm analyzing the works. Yeah, a personal choice.
I feel right now a little bit disappointed that you haven't watched the series of the Severance and also the film of Station 11, because that would be a classical question to compare actually the cinematic version of this novel and also novel itself.
No.
But you spared yourself from this trouble, I guess.
Yeah, so I just said, not my monkey, not my circus. I'm not interested in the adaptations and cinematic world. I'm focusing on the novels.
I think it's also fair to say that you are also protecting yourself from possible, maybe, disappointment when you see these characters in the movies.
Absolutely, because when I'm analyzing these characters, I also have my own perspective. But when I see them actually there in flesh as characters, acted by real actors and actresses, it can impede my way of analysis. So you're very right. It's also a way of protecting myself.
Sure. That's totally understandable. Actually, both in terms of the academic point of view and also the personal point of view. And maybe concretizing more this contemporary aspect in your research, I'd like to ask then, how do contemporary apocalyptic works or post-apocalyptic works differ from non-contemporary counterparts?
So, yeah, actually, contemporary versus non-contemporary definition, when we talk about that, when we think about that, so contemporary etymologically means like with the same time, of the same time, right? So that's why contemporary literature encompasses the works covering today or very recent past, mainly reflecting today's culture, technology, relationships, digital life, focusing more on realistic characters, even in a speculative genre like post-apocalyptic fiction, and relatable experiences of today's world. So by definition, in some books actually it is said to entail the time period from 1945 to today, but in my research I narrow it down to the 21st century because I think the time gap is too big. On the other hand, non-contemporary fiction, or some call it literary fiction, which I do not quite agree with because, that a novel is set in contemporary times doesn't make it less literary. And of course, if we dive into the question what literature is, the podcast would never come to an end. So I'm not starting that.
Thank you so much for stating that point.
So, actually, in a very basic sense, non-contemporary fiction refers to anything from the past, like classical, romantic, traditional, modern. Here I'm referring to the modernism from the early mid-20th century, which are distinct periods and carrying the distinct features of these periods. So this is the main difference between contemporary and non-contemporary. And why I specifically focus on contemporary fiction, the first factor that makes the contemporary novels a suitable choice for the benefit of my analysis is the most contemporary novels reflect the hidden anxieties of modern people. So besides, contemporary fiction has taken a turn into having this commitment to representing the emotional lives of real people. So in 1999, James Berger commented that people had witnessed the end of civilization at first hand, pointing out that the aftermath would look like a Nazi death camp, or an atomic explosion, or an ecological or urban wasteland. And more than 20 years later, actually more than 25 years later, right?
It's still correct.
Yes. Yeah. While we are talking about that, while I was writing those lines, a pandemic, deteriorating environmental crisis, global economic distress, financial insecurities have just added insult to the injury along with all these experiences. So this situation takes us directly to my reason for selecting contemporary novels. When James Berger wrote his lines in 1999, the world hasn't experienced the 9/11 yet. The civil war hadn't yet broken out in Syria. Russia hadn't yet invaded Ukraine, and millions of people hadn't yet had to leave their homelands just to be refugees or die in the open seas. The pandemic was nothing but a science fictional fantasy theme for most of the world. But when we are talking about that right now, on the other hand, life-changing turning points in our lives have already become a part of our daily lives. So that's another thing we have in common with the fictional characters in contemporary post-apocalyptic narratives. Like, besides first-hand experience, we can also witness these life-changing turning points all around the world. Thanks to internet, we can simply Google what we need to know in countless sources, just like the characters in one of the novels I'm analyzing. Like in the novel, it says, we were brand strategists, property lawyers, human resources specialists. We didn't know how to do anything, so we Googled everything. So as the common readers, as white-collar literary scholars, researchers, or reviewers of the contemporary times, we can confidently say only a few things would be more familiar to us than Googling something when we feel desperate to find an answer. So this plain fact of the 21st century brings us one step closer to the characters in contemporary world, and which serves to binding empathy, increasing the empathy or even identification with the characters.
Well, thank you so much for really clearly explaining such a challenging question, because I'm always amazed with the fact that how these terms like contemporary, modern, postmodern, these terms are really differently interpreted in different disciplines. So I totally agree with that. You have to also restrict yourself with a certain time zone actually when you are taking this topic. And another aspect that I realized in your explanation was that there was an emphasis on the empathy. And you also worked on this topic, empathy, in this framework of your research. And there are two other important concepts that come with this concept, empathy, and they are past experiences and similarity. So what role do they play actually with the concept of empathy in your research?
So thank you for asking this as well. So if we are to define empathy, I would like to take here Susan Keen's definition. This is a spontaneous sharing of affect that can be provoked by witnessing another person's emotional state, or by hearing about it, or even by reading about it. But of course, it's not enough. Witnessing, hearing, seeing. We do not actually have empathy for every incident we see or for every person we encountered. Similarity of past experiences contribute to increasing, strengthening the empathy, the feelings of empathy. So similarity, what I mean by similarity is actually refers to the, overlapping features between a subject and object. So in this case, we can compare it to the reader and the character. So, for instance, it's more likely that we develop empathy for a person if we have more in common with them, or if we know more about them, if we know their story even better. And also these common points can be gender, profession, age, personality, or just similar experiences. And so it is an important point actually in novels that the novel can create this fiction, actually can create this empathy in the reader. But I shall hasten to add that I'm not going to focus on readers' responses to characters, but how characters and settings that can stimulate the empathy have been created in those novels. Because empathy is an important part here. It represents one of the values of fiction, because it can improve readers' cognitive abilities by enriching and modifying beliefs about the way the human mind works, and by encouraging readers to take the characters' perspectives. It's actually from one of the groundbreaking works from my Professor Nunning. So it is actually one of the values that we expect from fiction, from literature. So we can feel for the characters, that would be sympathy, and we can feel with the characters, that would be empathy, when we read a good fictional novel. And in my research, the works I choose, of course, there is no accounting for taste, have been awarded or been well received by most of the readers who are interested in this genre, so which gives me a rich material to examine how the characters are built in a way that readers might feel close to them. There is this concept introduced by Melanie Green, if I'm not mistaken, this transportation concept. So when we read a good novel, a good fiction, sometimes we are transported to that novel. We forget where we are. And one important determiner for that is that we understand and sympathize, empathize, and maybe even not necessarily, but identify ourselves with the characters.
Well, thank you so much for this answer. And when we are talking about empathy, maybe it's an obvious point, but we are also talking about the individuals themselves, which is a predicate for talking about the empathy itself, focusing on this topic. And I'd like to ask you, why did you choose actually individuals and the emotions they express in such situations as your focus? And was that also related with filling a gap actually in post-apocalyptic research that you are trying to fill in, maybe?
Well, I'm not sure if I'm filling any gaps here, and I'm not sure if it was my intention at the beginning, but I think I'm filling some gaps intentionally.
It doesn't matter, actually. It will be always a contribution for the academia.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, to be honest, I haven't been following the most recent publications for a while. I mean, I find it interesting, and I believe there are still gaps in literature because in research, apocalypse so far has been mainly approached from its biblical sense, like the end of the world. And of course, it entails a rich base for analysis from religious, social, cultural, political, environmental analysis. But I don't think the individuals have been zoomed in on so far. Individuals have been shadowed under the magnificent light of the term apocalypse. So if we say that, fiction is a set of experiments in life, as George Eliot says, and psychology has been prominent in many literary works so far because it's about humans, apocalyptic fiction, on the other hand, tends to focus more on the social big order and the big effects of apocalypse, the tremendous change it's bringing upon on the world rather than individuals per se. So in my research, in my analysis, I strive to bring forward the hidden individuals in this genre.
Well, I know that it's a work in progress right now, what you are working on your PhD project, but I'd like to ask about your initial findings. And one of the most important parts actually in your research is the answering the question of how do individuals cope with what they have experienced in the aftermath of apocalypses. So how do you analyze individuals' coping strategies starting from your initial findings?
Yeah, it's still, as you said, also work in progress, but so far I can say that in different ways, the coping strategies, which makes it very interesting and very relatable to us. So in different ways, shaped both by their previous experience and by the social and material conditions they find themselves in. For example, some characters tend to adopt maladaptive coping strategies such as denial, avoidance, or excessive self-blame. I shouldn't have done that type of thing, which can push them eventually to extreme behaviors like isolating themselves, clinging to routines in a very unhealthy way, or joining cult-like groups, having a completely distorted way of seeing the reality. Other characters employ more adaptive strategies, like which I also analyze through the transactional model from Lazarus and Folkman, the transactional model of stress and coping. So characters so far who have managed to adopt a well-adaptive coping strategy, they evaluate the situation first. They appraise the situation. They consider their resources and respond either with problem-focused strategies. They aim at addressing concrete challenges if there is anything they can change, or emotion-focused strategies, which actually focuses more on regulating their feelings, their emotions when the change is impossible. And in my analysis, I examine coping strategies, these coping strategies also primarily through narrative techniques, because I have to remember that it's a text, it's a work in literature. So internal focalization, free indirect course, multi-perspectivity, first-person narrator, many narrative tools, they provide insight into how characters think and feel, allowing me to trace their appraisal evaluation processes. So I focus on how they interpret threats, losses, disruptions, how they regulate their emotions, and how these responses evolve over time. So by connecting these narrative portrayals with psychological theory, I aim to show both the effectiveness and limitations of different coping strategies, and as well as the ways characters influence and learn from each other in post-apocalyptic settings.
Actually, it would be fair to say that there are different coping mechanisms. So it's also maybe not really easy to find different patterns between different coping strategies, because individuals are also reacting to the apocalypse in a different ways. So that would be maybe also true for the transformation process of the individuals in these novels after the post-apocalypse. So how would you also comment on that? How do these characters transform themselves after seeing such, for example, atrocities, or in a more general term, apocalypse, aftermath of the apocalypse?
Yeah, it's a really good question because seeing that transformation is also very important in really good fiction. Because for that transformation to make sense to us, we need to see the characterization from the very beginning, and then that transformation should make sense to us. So the inner world of the character actually must be represented to us, to readers, from the beginning in a consistent way. So this narrative reality that it must be consistent from where they started and where they are going, in what way this transformation took place. So, of course, in multiple dimensions, these characters can show a transformation, psychological, social, moral. But the pace and nature of this change vary, and it must be the case. The characters must be different, must be portrayed differently from each other, especially in multi-perspective narration. It's really important when we see the internal worlds of characters and see to what extent does this transformation take place and in which direction. So, like I mentioned before, some characters, like hindered by maladaptive coping strategies, are driven to extremes, which reflects an avoidance of confronting the apocalyptic reality. Most protagonists, however, demonstrate adaptive transformation, and I find it really inspiring. Their development is shaped not only by the challenges they face, but also by interactions with other characters. So through these encounters, they acquire new coping strategies. They change their coping strategies, learn alternative ways to appraise and navigate this new world, often complete or balance each other in a healthy way. But of course, the transformations are not linear. That also wouldn't be realistic to have a linear, perfect, smooth transformation. There is always a recurring reassessment of self, environment, thinking, sometimes falling down, sometimes moving on. So, yeah, this is actually, in a nutshell, so to say, how characters in post-apocalyptic fiction, in a good post-apocalyptic fiction, show the transformation.
I really like that you emphasized the point of good when you were describing good post-apocalyptic fiction. But based on what you said, because you mentioned about these interactions and the transformation of interactions aftermath of the apocalypse, and I'd like to ask you, would you say that apocalyptic experiences decrease the gap between us and them in our perception, or do they cause this gap to widen? Of course, I'm asking these questions in the framework of your research, so maybe we can also restrict ourselves to your initial findings in these novels.
Well, I would say it depends. It depends on how we define apocalypse in the sense. Like, an apocalyptic event in itself can be something that would distance us from the characters. If it's something we could call distance, I would define it more as stretching our imagination and attach the emotions to speculative settings. But I see your point. I mean, it might impede the notion we talked about, the similarity or familiarity of past experiences. I mean, as we luckily haven't seen the end of the world yet. So, however, I'm approaching apocalypse from a more traumatic personal experience. As we mentioned, apocalypse now encompasses the anxieties of modern people. And now I'm experimenting in my thesis to see it, to compare it to our losses or challenges in our daily lives, like losing beloved ones, disease, having to migrate, losing your job, starving, fear of future, etc. We have actually these fears in ourselves. So I compare apocalypse from this perspective to a mirror, in theme parks, like magnifying, distorting, representing these fears and worries in our daily life in a more spectacular way. But at its core, the emotions elicited through these experiences are the same, or very similar at least. So when we look from this perspective, apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic narratives do not widen the gap between us and them. On the contrary, it collapses. I mean, they collapse the distance by foregrounding this shared vulnerability and this emotional recognition, sharedness.
Actually, it's a great news to hear that at least apocalyptic experiences make us closer to each other and decreases this gap between us and them. But yeah, sure. I mean, I'm not pretty sure that whether it could be also be considered as a good news. But moving on to these emotionals and also these individuals, and you are using interdisciplinary methodology in terms of examining the emotions of the individuals in your research. And also specifically as a toolbox, you are engaging with theories in the field of psychology and also actively using them in your analysis. So I'm also aware of the fact that there are many theories in psychology that could be used in literary research, but I'd like to ask you which psychological theories are you using in your research and what criteria did you use in selecting these psychological theories?
Yeah, you're very right. There are lots of theories in psychology. In my research, though, as I mentioned briefly, I primarily draw on Lazarus and Folkman's transactional model. I think it was introduced first in 1960s, and it is a model which is still valid. Of course, there are many papers, research, analysis on that, but the model itself keeps its validity. And it provides actually a structured way to understand how individuals appraise and respond to extreme events like apocalypses as well. So this model is particularly useful for me because it distinguishes between problem-focused strategies and emotion-focused strategies, so allowing me to analyze both the practical and emotional strategies characters employ. So this is the big theory, actually, the main theory I'm mainly drawing on. And the second theory, which actually is quite connected to this, is Nico Freida's taxonomy of emotions. So in his taxonomy, Freida sets some rules as to how emotions occur. So these are not random, these are not wild, but they follow some patterns and rules. So these sets of rules, laws, help me to analyze the emotional reactions of characters in a more contextualized way. And these are my actually primary theories. I also incorporate Susan Fiske's 5 social cores, 5 social motives, like belonging, understanding, controlling, self-enhancing, trusting, to explore how social needs actually shape characters' responses to crisis and their interactions with others. Because in post-apocalyptic worlds as well, there is still a society, even if it's not the same way we see right now but there are still people we have to deal with.
In order to talk about post-apocalyptic literature, there has to be a society, I guess. Implicitly, there has to be a society.
Well, there is also this one-man band stories like The Road, but you're right, there is still a society. I mean, the novel mainly focuses on the man and the boy, but there are other people.
Or I, Robot, guess there's just one man. Like at the no, I don't want to give any spoilers to our audience.
But at the end of the day, there's still a society.
There's still a society, I would say. But I mean, engaging with an interdisciplinary work, it also enriches the research itself for sure, but it also brings some challenges with it. And what was the challenges that you faced with actually during your research in terms of this interdisciplinary work tool that you used in your research?
Don't let me get started. Of course, there are challenges. From my perspective, I would say the main challenge is balancing the demands of literary analysis with psychological interpretation without reducing one to the other. Because psychological theories offer valuable insights, right, into coping, appraisal, resilience, but applying them to fictional characters requires careful attention to the narrative context. For example, I would need to distinguish between what a character really experiences versus how the text presents those experiences to the readers through narrative techniques. That is the main challenge for me, to find a balance. Another challenge, I would say, is this avoiding overextension of the theories, because not every psychological concept fits every character or scene. For instance, Lazarus and Folkman's coping model works well for some characters, but must be applied cautiously to minor characters, especially when we do not have access to their internal world. So similarly, like integrating Susan Fiske's social motives requires careful selection of moments in the text where these social needs are clearly represented so that I can maintain clarity and accessibility for readers. So combining literary and psychological analysis risks producing overly technical or fragmented interpretations. So to address this, I need to consistently anchor psychological readings in narrative examples, showing how theory is related, how it illuminates specific textual moments in narrative, rather than, abstracting the analysis away from the novels. So binding this connection can be sometimes challenging.
Yeah, it's totally a challenging task, but I'm pretty sure that you are also doing your best and you're also bringing your expertise and also experience when dealing with these kind of challenges in the interdisciplinary research. So I also prepared you a provoking question. Yeah.
I like provoking questions.
Actually, that will be also extending the boundaries of the topic that we are talking today, maybe, but you are working in literary studies, namely on fictional works. So to what extent are your findings transferable to real-life experiences? And are there any limitations we should consider when we, as readers of your work, try to apply your findings to real-life experiences? And I'd like to ask this question because we recently experienced this COVID-19 pandemic. So maybe it also made these novels, these post-apocalyptic novels, more relevant to our daily life experiences. So what would you say that, how could we also maybe transfer these insights in these novels to our daily lives?
That's interesting. While I was listening to you, I realized like 5 of my novels, the apocalypse in 5 of these novels is a pandemic.
That makes you a true oracle.
So, of course, I mean, there are many comparable sides in coping ways of characters to the ways we are coping with such big problems in our lives, I would say. You know what I said about George Eliot is fiction is experiments in life. Katrin Elgin calls it thought experiment, or it is, for example, simulation for Keith Oatley. So fiction is a simulation of life, or it's experiment in life, or it's thought experiment. So it has parallelism to real life. Of course, readers can certainly draw parallels to real life experiences of trauma, loss, coping, because the psychology behind these appraisal and coping strategies often resonates with what humans actually do. It is us. But, however, a big caveat, I would say, fictional worlds, of course, tend to be more condensed, dramatic, symbolically more loaded than real life. I mean, probably you won't encounter one day your neighbor turning into a zombie. I mean, hopefully not. So, but the patterns of coping and social motives or resilience can inspire reflection. They shouldn't be read as like literal predictions or how to survive in a post-apocalyptic world guide. So my thesis aims to offer psychological insights with a literary lens, not a survival guide. No. But although sometimes, thinking like a fictional character might help you survive a metaphorical apocalypse like an inbox, or coming deadlines or, after vacation backlog, you can, of course, apply these techniques also in your real life. But this is having this parallelism, so to say.
Actually, I find your answer to this question really valuable because just because of the fact that the characters in this narrative, in this work, are really successfully coping with the pandemic or an apocalypse, it doesn't mean that we can also really successfully, in any case, cope with the pandemic that we are having in the real world. So it's always maybe beneficial to keep in mind that it's a narrative at the end of the day, but it's also at the same time equally important to take most out of these narratives so that we can also question ourselves and also improve ourselves in terms of coping with these apocalypses maybe.
Absolutely, absolutely. That would be the key, actually. Questioning ourselves, stretching our imagination, and this theory of mind, putting ourselves in the shoes of other person, even this person is a fictional character, is a really good cognitive activity. And I think we need it, as humanity, we need it to train and stretch our brain muscles more than ever.
I'm not taking it as a general advice.
Not a literal advice.
Only in the framework of this recording, yeah. I would totally agree with you. Well, Selin, thank you so much for this really informative, insightful interview. I really enjoyed it talking with you and also learned a lot from what you said. And I'd like to also continue with your personal reflections. And I have prepared you 2 different questions. First of all, I haven't mentioned it yet, but we have a celebrity actually in our studio right now.
Oh, stop it.
Selin teaches English and German, but more importantly, what makes her a celebrity is that she has an Instagram account, Selinguist, in which she gives tips for learning both German and English. So I'd like to ask you then, how did your engagement project begin and how it is going right now?
During pandemic, it
Yeah.
started. Surprise, surprise.
Everybody needs a hobby.
Everybody needs a hobby. Well, I needed a job back then as well. I knew that teaching languages is something very important, very central to me, helping people along the way. And I was thinking, and social media, of course, was very much at forefront back then, even more during COVID times. And I started that page, and somehow was well received. And I enjoyed it very much. But unfortunately, these days, I have to actually lessen my focal points. So I haven't been able to post regularly for the last couple of years, but the page is still there. And after I finish my PhD thesis, hopefully, I actually aim to go back to my page because I miss my followers. And sometimes I receive really cute messages like, oh, we miss you, where are you? And so on. So, yeah.
That makes you
Emotional
motivated.
moments.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But as I said, with work, I've been working as a teacher at the university. I've been teaching English, German, and Turkish to corporate clients. I'm doing project management for language course, language school at the same time, and trying to write my PhD thesis. So it's quite heavy with my schedule. But yeah, I am planning to go back to my social media celebrity world as soon as possible.
Based on what you said, actually, it's also maybe a little bit answering my question, but how difficult it is to find a balance between your academic activities and engagement projects, such as managing an Instagram account. But you already mentioned that you are working on a really tight schedule, I guess.
Yes, it is difficult, but it's part. I mean, I really find it valuable when especially academics, PhD students are very honest with that, because most of us are having this imposter syndrome. No, I cannot do it. I cannot catch up with that. I cannot keep up with the schedule. No one can. That's no worries. It's fine. And sometimes it's really important that you prioritize your focal points, your focuses, and also prioritize yourselves. It shouldn't lead to having a burnout.
Yeah.
No, it is important to take care of yourselves. It's something I learned actually in the last 2 years, I can say, and slowly, that I am also prioritizing myself. Because when you do too much, then you cannot actually give the effort that each project deserves. A PhD project is, we can say, a lifetime project. It is it's a milestone in your academic career if you want to pursue a career in academy. But in any way, it's something you are investing time, sometimes material sources, your efforts and everything. But it must be fun. It
Sure.
must be interesting for you. And if you have to sacrifice from other things in your life just to continue that thesis, it won't be interesting and fun anymore. And then when it's not interesting, it's not worth writing it. It must be interesting for you, first of all.
I think also it's also fair to say that setting the bar too high on an unrealistic level also wouldn't help with the project itself first and also with the personal health, I would say.
Absolutely. You know, as they say, perfect is the enemy of the good.
Yeah.
First, we need to strive for being good, and then maybe we can give the final touches. But you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to do it completely, thoroughly in all aspects. So you need to be also fair to yourself in terms of setting expectations from yourself, so to say.
Thank you so much, Selin, for your insights. And I'd like to also thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me here today. I really enjoyed it, and I hope our listeners will enjoy it as well. At least as much as we did.
Yeah. And we wish you all the best in your future academic endeavors and also in your personal journey. So with that said, we are closing today's episode and we would like to say goodbye to you and we would like to see you in our next episodes. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the HGGS podcast series, Hasan'dan. In this series, we bring you conversations with experts from a wide range of disciplines, from the social sciences to the humanities, from law to economics. If you enjoyed our podcast, we invite you to explore our previous episodes and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a new episode. Stay tuned for more insightful interviews coming soon.